Bulletin board systems, laying the foundation for the World Wide Web. Thesis. Bulletin board systems, BBS's implementation and utilization helped lay the foundations for the Internet and World Wide Web. Through not only network systems engineering, but also through the many individuals' users' future developments. Implementation. Computers, particularly in the 1970s and into the 1980s, took off in a personal computer revolution. Many of the people who assembled the kits of parts to make personal computers were referred to as hobbyists, and they like to experiment and explore what they could do with their new computers and peripheral components. Some hobbyists also attained modems, which allows them to transfer data from computer to computer over phone lines using phone calls and transferring files and messages to one another, computer to computer, peer to peer. Now, the modems were quite slow, even for the time, extremely slow, to the point where you could see the characters being written one by one across the line at about 30 characters a second, or about 300 bits per second of transferred digital data. Now, a modem actually stands for modulator demodulator, and it is used in this way to transform digital data, or at least create a copy of the digital data in the form of tones, which can be sent over the phone line. And then they can be demodulated by another modem back into digital data at the other computer, which it can use, and vice versa. Now, bulletin boards are based on the concept of physical bulletin boards, a place for communal posting of information and messages. These boards generally consisted of just a list of messages or posts. They were stored on one individual's hosting computer, and that hosting computer was allowing other machines to call it freely. And when those other PCs called it, they could pull the messages from the message board, and they could also post new messages to the message board slowly, but they could do it and one at a time. The utilization of the boards was just so, generally and originally mostly for messaging and posting messages, very similar to an internet forum, basically just an electronic public forum. Another large use for BBSs was communal file sharing, so posting a file that could then be transferred to other computers that call in. And obviously this involved large amounts of internet, or not pre-internet piracy, in illegally sharing and copying software amongst individuals. This will also apply to games, and often games could be played on the BBS, that is, on the host computer, literally. So you would be connected to the host's computer, you would start the game. Often the host had to physically place the game disc into a drive so that you could read and run the game on that machine, but you were seeing it on your machine, basically, which is similar to modern gaming, but with, instead of there being a server, there's literally a host, which is also true in modern gaming, less so nowadays, but there are no servers here. It's just direct peer-to-peer computer sharing. These hosts were referred to as system operators, so they ran the BBS or bulletin board system. They operated it. So they're the individual with the host computer. It's their computer. To run it effectively, they had to leave the computer on 24/7, 365, so that people could always call in. It's a lot like having a personal computer that is also a server that other people can just use. It also meant that these people generally had to go to great expense to have it running, not only in the form of computers, drives, etc., but also the phone lines. So having multiple phone lines, paying for phone charges if you're going out also. And because each call was peer-to-peer, whilst the phone line was being used by one connection, it couldn't be used by any other connections. So you needed multiple phone lines to not did not have a traffic jam of access. Scaling. So a lot of the interesting parts for BBSs is that they're local. This is mostly dictated by the phone system of the time. The additional charges for long distance calls, which are literally just out of like half a county area, were extremely expensive at the time. So having long transfers of data outside of your locality, phone locality, could be very expensive. So it created these local localities of independent BBS groups that had some crossover, obviously, because they could call each other, and there were times where it was less expensive, they would call each other. And they were also normally set up originally by some kind of local group, maybe a club, a computer club. So there was a very strong sense of camaraderie in each local messaging board. It's very interesting. However, it still ran on rudimentary legacy hardware and software. So these two things combined made it rather difficult to scale into a global BBS system. There are like disparate islands of BBS loosely conjoined to each other. Besides the limitations of the software, hardware, and the phone line system, which really isn't in any sense of the word broadband and really limits access, which also inheritedly limited the extendability of BBS systems. That reliance on the phone meant that you're always tied to how many phone lines you could use and what the expense of the phone line was and how much data you could pump through a phone line. Peer-to-peer connection meant that there's no distributed network hubbing. So really, I mean, kind of not really. So it's like I connect to it, then someone else can connect to it, then the BBS can connect to something, another BBS. It's very one at a time, very slow compared to modern internet interactions. Then there was no collective grouping or control or committee over all the different system operators. Anyone who bought a computer, knew how to put it together, knew how to set up the modem and the BBS software, could run their own BBS and be their own sysop. So it was like very much each independent individual island. Now FidoNet did try to connect these BBSs, but mostly as a cut around to paying for long distance phone calls. So proto and early internet. The original real forms of computers were always mainframes. They were too big and too expensive to be for individual use. A group, university or company would have one computer mainframe and many terminals that could access that one computer, its drives, its data, its processing power, and you had to schedule use of time with other people on your shared computer and resources, etc. ARPANET, just to touch on, is often cited as like a proto-internet. It is a military experiment into creating an internet for communication amongst the military, and in time of basically nuclear war was its original intent. Personal computers, however, became commonplace at their mainframes. You could build your own computer, you could have your own computer, which was a big deal, but the connectivity to other terminals or computers was lost when you had your own computer. Modems kind of brought that back, allowing you to use the pre-existing phone line system to call each other with digital information instead of speaking to each other, so your computers could call each other. Basically, dial-up, very early, rudimentary dial-up, and it would lead basically to the uses of dial-up with ISPs or internet service providers who were using later on protocols that allowed for the internet and the World Wide Web as we know it today. And because of those protocols and the internet service providers' commercial corporate nature and its interaction with the phone company was much more expandable and practical for widespread use. So these are two pretty long quotes, but basically it talks about how BBSs were literally just one individual running a computer somewhere. It could be anywhere, in their basement or closet or in a store. And it's just that computer, and you can interact with that one, and then you can go interact with another one. It's not like the internet and Sir Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web protocols, TCP, IP also kind of stuff, did not exist with BBS. So there was no way to really have a universal communication system through it, like was Tim Berners-Lee's intent with HTML, URL, and HTTP stuff for the internet. That kind of foundation just didn't exist for BBSs. They did kind of act like standalone servers, and FidoNet helped link them together as nodes, which made them more like a network of servers similar to the internet or World Wide Web, but not quite at all the same. There was no central protocol. It was just basically a list of BBSs that formed a node that would chain together to allow you to use just local calls to reach a long distance BBS, and so avoid paying the extra expense. That was the original intent of FidoNet, which I think I'm about to talk about. Yep. So like I said, you're avoiding long distance phone line usage by using many local lines chained together as a series of nodes, like nodes in a linked list, to reach a distant target machine without ever having to use a long distance phone call line, or what the phone company would call a trunk line, which is where all the expense for long distance calls came from. So when FidoNet was implemented, the whole idea was just a node list. So it's a list of BBSs acting as nodes. They can just chain, and some protocol for figuring out which one to call to reach your target. But that was mostly done by hand as new nodes were added. There wasn't like a dynamic algorithm for it. It was just set up mostly by the creator of FidoNet on his own computer. So we'll get to that though. As I say, there was one creator on his own computer. He made the original node list with a set size data array. So at some point they realized they were going to run out of data for their node list, which obviously limited the extendability of and growth of FidoNet. And it had no governing body either, had no committee. So the creator couldn't exercise any kind of control over it. And when he did try to do that, there was a lot of internal strife amongst the community, and he ended up leaving and letting FidoNet basically die off, which it did, and it was eventually replaced by the internet. So that individual who created FidoNet is called Tom Jennings. And I basically talked about him. We talked about sys operators, but there are many, many sys operators, and like I said, anybody could find them. So there's a lot of the early hobbyist communities you find sys operators. So Jack Ricard is was the editor of Board Watch magazine, which was a magazine trying to become a central listing for all BBSs. However, it eventually transitioned to being the internet mostly, and then entirely. And Jack Ricard has some interesting things to say about his view on the change between BBSs and the internet, and how it was much more of a smooth transition, a spectrum, which is different than a lot of opinions of the diehard old school hobbyist BBSers, but I think it's more accurate in that the concept of what they were trying to do mostly stayed the same, but the implementation became far better with a totally different system, and people just naturally switched over to it. So in conclusion, the widespread use of bulletin board systems led to the protoforms of social communication, network infrastructure, and core concepts of the modern internet and World Wide Web structure, protocol, and the form of information exchange and communication. And these are my references, and thank you very much.